And one little anecdote I'll tell is that when I was there in late summer of 2009, I was at a meeting with Mohammed Zia, who was the minister in charge of rural rehabilitation and development, and he said that in the absence of the capacity to have protective import tariffs, Afghan, and I'll paraphrase them, Afghan farmers are screwed because there's other stuff coming in over the border and they can't protect themselves. They cannot function as viable financial agricultural entities. So he said, when I asked him, I said, is there any country in the world that is protecting the Afghan government's right to impose protective import tariffs on food? He said, no. I said, what about Washington? He said, no, they're dead set against it. So Washington, while supposedly trying to help the Afghan people, including the Afghan farmers, is actually taking a position against protective food import tariffs that is really the only hope for Afghan agriculture.
You know the person who you talked about, he gave a PowerPoint? His name is Muhammad Qayyumi, and he's the president of California State University, which used to be called Hayward, but now East Bay.
Yes.
He came and gave a talk here, and one student described his talk. He's running for the presidency of Afghanistan. That's exactly what he said.
Yes, and he's the one you're talking about who did the PowerPoint. Exactly,
yes,
exactly right. There was also this guy from the Afghan government. I found it disturbing because it seemed to be tone deaf. It seemed to be, it's sort of a U.S. talk. This is stuff will go very far in U.S. media because the way of looking at the people of Afghanistan is just these sort of metric widgets that you can move around. They have these resources.
Yes, he comes from a very wealthy family, and he studied in the American University in Beirut in 1968. And guess who is a friend of? His closest friend, the first American ambassador to Afghanistan.
Al-Qazzaz. Yeah.
They went together. Yeah.
I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, we don't want to be too broad brushed, but a lot of these players are making a killing financially. Let's think about Peter Galbraith, who I almost met with.
His book, The End of Iraq. Yes.
Well, here's a guy. He was second in command of the UN mission in Afghanistan. Then it comes out. Of course, he has a falling out with the head of it, so he leaves about a year ago. But then we find out he's making millions of dollars
from the Kurdish area
after being a consultant, after having worked hard to create the invasion in the first place.
Yep. And he's a consultant for the Kurdish, by the way, and he was very influential, including many, many clauses in the so-called Iraqi constitution protecting the Kurds. And he wrote a book called The End of Iraq, which is fascinating. And it's really amazing. Now, do you think the solution is to leave this country or what? And we destroy this country, and we probably, we contributed to their decadence rather than their development. Do you think the solution is to leave or something else? Because there are a lot of people, they say, if we leave, the mess will be worse.
Yeah. Well, in military terms, I really cite what Dan Ellsberg said about Iraq and also about Afghanistan. He said U.S. military withdrawal is a very bad idea, and all the other options are worse. And that doesn't mean that's the case for everybody in the country. There might be some differences in Afghanistan between rural and urban areas in terms of who benefits and who doesn't. But I mean, militarily, it's sort of kicking the beehive again and again, to use that sort of cliche, but it's just this sort of reflex that if we can just bring more violence to bear in our own strategic and tactical way, we will make things better. And I think that has not been the case. One of the unsettling things, and this is sort of the median political currency in the U.S., is that, oh, we solved that. Well, there's 1 million dead people in Iraq. And so it's sort of a notion that, well, they're not putting up as much resistance anymore, so I guess we made progress. Well, killing a lot of people will sort of do that sometimes, but the notion that that is some sort of solution is sort of morally obscene, to put it mildly. I would say that there are moral and ethical obligations, but we don't have moral and ethical obligations to keep killing people. I think that's sort of a perverse version of accountability and moral responsibility. In the case of Afghanistan, my own sense of it is that, if you read the history of the last 30 years, at one juncture after another, the U.S. government has chosen the path of my enemy is my friend. We're willing to make all sorts of alliances with cutthroat killers like Hekmatar and the Haqqani network. And you know, I met with the great feminist in Kabul, Malala Joya, about 14 months ago. And she was talking about Abdullah, who of course was being touted in the U.S. media as an alternative to Karzai. And she said, you know, you can take a warlord, you can give him a haircut, you can put him in a three-piece suit, he's still a warlord. And given what happened in the early mid-1990s around Kabul, you have these people responsible for actively shelling and rocketing, killing 60, 70,000 people in the space of a couple of years. And now they're being touted as, these are our great democratic allies. Many of them are misogynists. We know that Hekmatar got huge amounts of CIA aid through the ISI in Pakistan. So it just goes to, like, when people often in political terms say, oh, we have a responsibility to stay, what they really mean is we have to keep sending troops, we have to keep bombing, and we want to write a whole new chapter of the same syndrome that we've done time after time after time. My feeling is there is a, you know, when Afghans say, don't abandon us again, I think that's a very real human message we should heed. Just the question is, what does that mean? Does it not mean that we have a responsibility to, if you will, bombard them, figuratively speaking, with food, medicine, humanitarian aid, construction materials that could go through some projects like the National Solidarity Program, perhaps others that have shown some track record, but instead it's framed in the U.S. media as abandonment equals pulling the military out.
But if we pull the military out, at least we remove one of the elements in the conflict. So the American soldiers are an important element of that conflict. And from my perspective as a student of that area, if we remove them from that conflict, one of the elements is gone, and it's a very, very powerful element, and let the people themselves settle the issue. There may be some violence, there may be some blood, but sooner or later they will come to their senses and they will settle the issue. After all, this country has a long history, and they kind of draw on that history to bring about some sort of reconciliation between the different parties.
And some cohesion that is not a strong central state, but it's not totally diffused,
decentralized,
or something. With, you know, as happened, as I understand it, in the 50s or 60s or whatever. I think the Carnegie Endowment report that came out in the beginning of 2009 is very much in line with what you're saying, where they said the biggest force for recruitment of the insurgencies is the presence of foreign troops in Afghanistan.
But the U.S. still has a responsibility to help build these countries. After all, we destroyed them. I mean, look what we did to Iraq, and look what we did to Afghanistan. And these people are entitled for some help in rebuilding their country.
I think it's a quandary because, in a sense, the U.S. government has forfeited any moral standing or credibility to be an honest broker or helper, and yet has that very responsibility to be helpful. And I know, and this has happened to other people, and my visit to Kabul, even though it was we organized it carefully, we had 30 meetings, it was only for 5 days, you know. I don't know that much about it per se. I tried to learn what I could, but when I came back from talking to a lot of people, the idea of just U.S. get out lock, stock, and barrel, it didn't seem to make sense. And I found that with other people who go and they say, like, just get everything U.S. out of there. It's a paradox because we need to get the U.S. military out of there, but the U.S. has a responsibility
to rebuild. You know, we have only 5 minutes left, and I want to shift the discussion to another subject. You have written on so many subjects, and I'd love to talk to you for 3 hours. You thought a great deal about the industrial military complex. Now, can you give me an idea how do you challenge this industrial military complex? We spend approximately $3 billion a day, according to my latest accounting. You have the formal budget about 625 or whatever it is. By the time you add Afghanistan and Iraq and other supplemental, become about $1 trillion.
And nuclear weapons from Department of Energy.
Yes, yeah. So we spend about $3 billion a day. How can you challenge this military establishment? They are everywhere, at the university, at my campus, at the private corporation. They are everywhere. Everybody has a vested interest in the military establishment. I asked a priest the other day, why don't you talk about the industrial military complex in your church? And guess what he told me? He said half of them half of my audience will leave if I talk about it.
Yeah.
And these are people of peace. These are Christian ministers.
Yeah, it's so ubiquitous. It's like a metaphor would be, there are fish swimming around in water, and I say, well, what are we going to do about, the water's there, but it's so common that we don't even get conscious of it. It's like what water, because we swim in it, and yet the activist responsibility is to raise those questions, to, so to speak, in the echo chamber, talk about talk about what the wallpaper is, what the sounds are that are being generated, where they're coming from, in whose interests they serve, what is the national interest. We need to redefine and challenge that. It's always been a responsibility and challenge of progressive activists to raise the most uncomfortable questions. As a tactical or broader strategic matter, how will we accomplish that? It's very uphill, but we have to keep trying it and doing it more methodically. I think, in a way, we need to be less rhetorical and more radical. Less rhetorical so that we can communicate the essence of the points that we want to make and what's at stake in human terms, and more radical in the sense of going to the roots of what our problem is, because it's totally connected to our economic crisis. I mean, the two big things are military spending and regressive taxation. Until we turn that around, working people are going to continue to be squeezed with very dire results.
But in the last election, nobody talked about these issues.
Well, this is a political crisis of democracy, I believe, where unless we can invigorate from the bottom up, electorally as well as outside of the electoral arena, then we're going to have this continued corporatization of consciousness and of what is considered to be a real option. And those voices need to be raised, and they have to be supported, whether it's congressional level or anything else. We need to raise hell about it.
But I get the feeling even some of the liberals are afraid to talk about this subject.
Sometimes people who go by liberals are especially afraid to talk about it. There's that great statement by the Italian anti-fascist in the 30s. He's really a communist, lowercase c, communist, and why am I forgetting his name? He talked about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, right? And that's the situation that we need right now. We realistically, we are pessimistic, but the optimism of the will is the only thing. I'm thinking about Antonio Gramsci, when you live under repressive regimes or a society that has elements of democracy like ours, it still applies. We need pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. It's really the only hope. And one other thing, you talk about the religious people, so I'll throw this in. The priests or clergy or whatever. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, during World War II, he said that the only hope for resistance is in establishing and widening community. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
There's no lone ranger, there's no one person or a small group of people who's going to turn this around. We need to build coalitions and build community.
We have about 1 minute left. Do you have any word of wisdom to convey to our audience?
I wish I could think of some words of wisdom, but in lieu of them, I would say that giving up is not a practical or moral option. Everybody cares about the future. They care about their loved ones. They care about people who maybe they will never meet, either because they don't know them or they will come after we pass away. But we have a responsibility and we can fulfill it.
So you continue to be an optimist and continue to work hard.
I'm a skeptical optimist. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful and delightful discussion. And I hope to see you some other time when you are in Sacramento. And thank you for watching, and we hope to see you on another program on Focus on the Middle East. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
صبري يا تيفرج ربي صبري